Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Hampton. I'm the director of the Townsend Humanities Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this first of several events that we're putting on around the visit of this year's Ueno's lecturer, who is Ben Ratliff. Today, we're going to have a conversation on music and virtuosity, featuring a panel of experts, which I will introduce in a second. And tomorrow, Ben will be giving a lecture called Mere Virtuosity, which is going to take place at 4 o'clock in the Maud Fife Room. That's in 315 Wheeler Hall. So I hope to see you for that event as well. I'd also like to, before we start, thank and acknowledge the staff of the Townsend Center, and also especially my predecessor, Townsend director Alan Tansman, whose idea it was to put this event together, and who basically did all the work so that I get to stand up here and talk. And so I really want to thank Alan for his genius and the staff for their hard work and genius. So let me introduce the panels, and this is going to be a discussion moderated by Ben largely, but it's, I gather, going to be fairly free-form, but I'll just tell you who is here. So Kim Kashkashian is an internationally renowned violist who has worked to broaden the range of technique and repertoire for the instrument. Among the honors she has received are the Grammy Award for the Best Classical Instrumental Solo Album for Kurtog and Ligeti, Music for Viola, and the George Peabody Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Music in America, and membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As a soloist, she's appeared with the orchestras of Berlin, London, Vienna, Milan, New York, and Cleveland, and she teaches at the New England Conservatory. John Santos is a central figure in the Afro-Latin jazz scene, a seven-time Grammy-nominated percussionist and United States Artists Fontanals Fellow. He is a performer, composer, and teacher and producer. He served as a resident artistic director at SF Jazz and as a member of the Latin Jazz Advisory Committee of the Smithsonian Institution. He's performed and recorded with numerous artists, including Dizzy Gillespie, Tito Puente, Max Roach, and Arturo Sandoval. Ken Ueno is Associate Professor of Music at UC Berkeley, where he holds the Jerry and Evelyn Hemmings Chambers Chair. He's a composer, vocalist, and sound artist, and has won the Rome Prize and the Berlin Prize for his work as a composer. His compositions have been performed at Lincoln Center, the Kennedy Center, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Kim Kashkashian is among those who have played his work. And finally, our Ueno's lecturer for this year is Ben Ratliff. He is music critic and author. He was the jazz and pop critic of the New York Times for 20 years, and he's the author of 4 books, Every Song Ever, 20 Ways to Listen in an Age of Musical Plenty, which is from 2016, The Jazz Ear, Conversations Over Music, his remarkable book on John Coltrane, The Story of a Sound, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Jazz, A Critic's Guide to the 100 Most Important Recordings. And his articles have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Esquire, Slate, Rolling Stone, and elsewhere, and he teaches at NYU. So it's a great pleasure to welcome these 4 wonderful thinkers and musicians today, and please join me in thanking them for coming.
And thank you all for coming. So the topic on the table today is virtuosity. So what do we hope to get out of this exercise? We represent a multiplicity of musical traditions here. Critics are part of, musical life too. And I don't seek or expect an answer to the question, virtuosity, good or bad. Maybe we will find out that the word isn't really about music at all. Maybe we will find out that it simply has to be a word with no fixed meaning. But the fact is the word has persisted, and it still seems to have some power and some value and some specific meanings to different kinds of musicians. The word itself, as I understand it, first came into circulation in the late 18th century, virtuoso, meaning really a master of the mechanical part of a fine art. And so if that's our answer, then we can just go home, because that sounds fairly cut and dried at first glance. But then you look at it harder and you think, okay, master of the mechanical part of a fine art. Well, what's a master exactly? And what is the mechanical part of a fine art? And what is a fine art? Ultimately, I think the subject today of virtuosity is, best of all, a pretext to have three really great musicians get together and talk about what is most important to them in music. So I want to start with just a general question about when you hear the word virtuosity, what or whom do you think about?
Okay.
I mean, if you want to, you can start from an early idea that you may have had about it, or a current one.
Well, I think there's something I've always known about what is the implication of virtuosity. And even when I was a beginning violin student, when I was 9 years old, and I was listening to the Paganini violin concerto, and I was thinking to myself, well, actually, I can play all those notes. I just can't get from one to the other. And that, for me, still is part of my today's definition of a real virtuoso is someone who knows how to get from one place to another really well and understands the spatial relationships in terms of time, in terms of sonic awareness, in terms of the body, geometry, and all of this combined in motion that where resistance has been eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's been a pretty serious effort for me, I have found that when I can eliminate resistance of all kinds, that I'm much more free to create and produce what I might want. And I'll just add one more thing and then I'll stop, which is that part of that business of not being in resistance is to understand that desire is resistance. So if you do have an intention, it's very different than having a desire. And you can get pretty tied up in knots, desiring to sound this way or that way, or to do this or that. But you don't get tied up in knots if you intend to do that thing. So that's a psychological aspect of this that I find extremely important.
Desire is resistance,
Yes.
but intention means...
Is freedom to move. Yeah.
Means you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm done. For now.
Ken, what do you think about?
I think that term might be located in terms of genre specificity, because I didn't grow up with classical music. My first instrument was electric guitar, and I was aware certainly of people who were virtuosic, but that word
as
probably,
guitarists.
yeah, you know, the Eddie Van Halens and the Eric Claptons and the Jimi Hendrix, who was my biggest inspiration to be a musician. Every once in a while, reading an article that there might be an invocation of that term, but there might be, oh, he's a greatest guitarist ever, or he's awesome, or this is much more colloquial terms, right, than that word. And so a lot of what Kim said I would agree with, but even in thinking about the people who inspired me the most, the Jimi Hendrixes and the John Coltranes, who have there's a kind of relationship to embodied awareness with the instrument, and this kind of fluency with it, and a commitment that, and when you talk about resistance, though, the people who've inspired me the most have ventured to free themselves of a kind of meta resistance. Like, we're normally kind of playing to cultural norms of expectation, and we're kind of revivifying those expectations, and then it's easier to assess if we meet a particular standard, and whether it be grades or playing a scale or whatever, right? And then, so the people who've meant the most to me, Jimi Hendrix and Coltrane, are people who kind of confounded pre-existing historical values and freed themselves of it, and went beyond historical norms of performance practice to invent their own, and as example, help free the rest of us.
Can we talk about resistance for a second? Because actually, I did not mean that it makes things easy. And your examples of those great artists, they were full of the ability to communicate human resistance, artistic resistance, resistance in place. That's part of what gets communicated. So that's, it's
well,
very
even
important.
on a very more local level, you've talked about resistance with your instrument, and like the note, that moment of expressivity is a kind of local manifestation of resistance. I feel like I've heard you talk about before.
We have talked about it before, and it's an important thing to be able to convey and to use, because again, as you said, we're operating through mass and through a material, and sound is mass in a way. So we're. I should shut up.
Well, John, what do you think about? What do you think about when you hear the word?
Well, Ben, first I want to say thank you very much for having me here, and to Alan for inviting me. I'm very honored to be part of this conversation. And I also have to comment that those socks are like really incredible.
Oh, thanks.
Well, with that done, I'm reminded by what Kim said about with desire and intention. It reminds me of something I came across yesterday that I had seen before, but it's a Henry Ford quote of all things that says, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And it reminded me of that, the idea of intention, what that means. We're talking to that with our kids, and so it's kind of fresh in my head. But the word, the concept of virtuosity, it really is an external thing for what, because I also did not come up in the classical, and I've never been associated with classical music. Or I shouldn't say never, because I had the honor of playing with the San Francisco String Quartet, but I have never studied classical music. And I always associate the term with classical music and also with soloing. And in the traditions that I'm familiar with, which are Afro-Caribbean traditions, the soloist is not the goal. The soloist is not the most important thing, and there are a lot of elements that you strive for. You mentioned mastery of the mechanics, and master is a word that we use. There are master musicians who are in total control of a lot of aspects of playing. It has to do with tone and the traditional repertoire and their inventiveness and their stamina and all the things that go into being able to speak and tell a story and be very communicative when they play. And also on the level of calling the spirit, calling the ancestors into the room. The sacred drumming traditions that are West and Central African in origin, that are such a big part of not only the sacred music tradition, but have informed popular music in Cuba and throughout the Caribbean. In those cases, you have to be such a master of what you're doing. And the word virtuoso overlaps, perhaps, but you have to recognize the lead drummer, for example, recognizes when somebody in the congregation is getting the spirit, so to speak, and plays specific phrases and specific figures on the drum, which are intended to have an entity, an ancestor possess come into that person and call the spirits into the room. So there's a strong responsibility and in a lot of ways we could consider it virtuosic grasp of the tradition that has to do with the melodies that are being sung, what song is being sung, what deity or orisha or which specific spirit might be coming into the room, recognizing all those aspects. And that's what makes a master drummer, for example, knowing exactly what to play when and where to direct the energy. But the idea of, when you mention who comes to mind, I always think of it in terms of a soloist, somebody who's an impressive soloist who plays a lot of notes. And I think of Charlie Parker or Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa, people who are just very impressive and fast and precise and all that. But that doesn't really apply traditionally into the music that I've grown up with and studied, although it has been added because it's also a influx and constantly evolving style. So a lot of, by nature of the beast, it's always evolving and always including those concepts. So now we have also in our tradition virtuosic drummers. I think of Giovanni Hidalgo and Anthony Carrillo and many others, younger generation, and who are, by every sense of the word, virtuosic because they're incredibly fast and have a mastery of the language of the drum, and they have all of those aspects, and they bring that to play in a way that the elders didn't quite have. And I'll close that section by saying that one of our great elders, a master drummer, was Manny Oquendo, who I'm sure you knew, in New York City, a Puerto Rican percussionist who's one of the teachers and inspirations for my generation and for many, many generations of musicians and dancers in New York. He was a Nuyorican, he was born in New York, and he came up studying Cuban dance music and Puerto Rican dance music, and it's a language, and it's a style and a language, and the percussion plays a very important role in it. But when he was asked to comment on what he thought about this young generation of musicians like Anthony Carrillo and Giovanni on the percussion, playing so many drum set rudiments and fast figures that his generation never studied that. His comment was, too many rolls and no butter. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that kind of tells you where that style of virtuosity is with our tradition.
Mm-hmm. But so when we're talking about music that is, in some sense, like dictated by the spirit world, say, and we're talking about great players within that tradition. Is there an idea of virtuosity as kind of a level that keeps rising? So-and-so is the best at doing that kind of drumming.
Not the best, but right away, before you finish that sentence, Francisco Aguabella comes to mind for me, because I was close with Francisco. He was a godfather for me, and he lived here in San Francisco for many years. I got to see him play in ceremonies with him. Yeah. And he was a gentleman who had all those aspects that you're talking about. He was a master. He knew what to play, and he got stronger while we got weaker. All the young guys who were playing with him, after several hours would go by of intense playing, would be getting tired, and he would be, he'd be getting stronger. Yeah. And his sound would be getting bigger, and it was just a phenomenal.
Well, so then this is where we start to talk about people as opposed to an abstract idea of, virtuosity, meaning like the highest refinement, whatever that means, as if there were one highest refinement for all music. Is virtuosity, might it be about lineage? I want to ask all of you, do you aspire, or is somewhere in your head the idea of being a musician at a level of an older musician who you might have learned from or studied with, or who was important to you?
Well, certainly in my case, but you guys
such that you have, you have received the lesson from this other person, and you very much want to sort of pass it on. Sorry, I cut you off.
Well, just again, right away for me, Armando Peraza comes to mind. These are great masters who lived here in the Bay Area who I had a direct relationship with, and I very much emulate them and learned a great deal from them. But I also am very realistic in knowing that they were virtuosos, and I don't consider myself a virtuoso, and I'll never be at the level that they were. They had this special spirit about what they did specifically, and I'm learning from them and many others, and there's a lot to learn in this tradition about what to play, about rhythmic traditions from certain areas, and I'm really an eternal student of that. But those guys were masters who grew up in specific traditions, and I learned a great deal from them and try to emulate them, but I don't feel like I'll ever be the kind of master that they were in what they do, what they did.
What about you, Ken?
I agree with your proposition, maybe that virtuosity, ideas of virtuosity is also culturally grounded.
Yeah.
And about a month ago, as an ancillary kind of satellite event to our discussion here, I was able to invite a koto player from Japan that I had been able to collaborate with, and her performance, and collaborating with people like that who are deeply rooted in Japanese traditional music and aesthetics. There's a different sense of time and space and silence, but also kind of embodied sense of presence in that silence, and in these different sensitivities. So that also makes me wonder that how many different world cultures were I to be more aware of would help teach me about those different values too. And so virtuosity per se still is also grounded in like the Western tradition, right? It has all these colors that kind of point to that. And so even with my background playing electric guitar as a teenager, I didn't hear that word as much, you know. And then in terms of my own performance practice, I guess I'm patient zero. So
How do you mean?
I don't have a teacher. What I do is just so weird that nobody else either wanted to do it so far or whatever, right? So like
Can you explain a little bit about your performance practice?
Well, as a vocalist, I specialize in what people call extended techniques, and sure. I mean, I've been inspired by different vocal traditions that are more unique compared to Western classical bel canto singing, like throat singing, which I've drawn and researched from different cultures, but I've also invented my own ways of thinking, of singing multiphonics, and also my own contexts in which those that I perform and that I compose to try to frame my vocal performance in its kind of temporal structure, so that we can house it in a concert hall, right? You know, and that's part of my message is person specificity. That a lot of my music is originally designed, at least, for one specific performer to perform, and it differs from the business practice that my teachers were engaged in. You know, you write an orchestra piece, any orchestra can play. Write a string quartet, then you can send it to, this transportability that that I didn't feel to be as special, to my favorite listenings. Right? Jimi Hendrix is not transportable. John Coltrane is not transportable, and so I've been trying to find ways to bring that into classical music, if you will, by with my collaborations and also my own performance practice. And the latent message is that every audience member, all of us, have some special quality that we are not transposable, and that there is virtuosity, if you will, that makes as a way of life in our own special endeavors or hobbies, or the thing that we do as a livelihood that we have expertise in, that there's virtuosity, we need to celebrate that.
So everything you said made perfect sense, and I just want to ask one more question before I ask Kim the same things. When you are essentially inventing your own technique, coming up with your own goals in sound,
yes,
are you concerned with the things that people who chase virtuosity in perhaps a more traditional way are concerned with, like articulation. Like within the language that you're creating, are you thinking about how can I do this with precision? How can I do this with articulation? How can I do it with ease, etc.? In other words, I'm.
Oh, it's many things.
Yep.
Because initially, I think I don't just sit there and say, "Oh, I want to make something new." I might be playing around, babbling, and or in performance, or in a studio testing things out, and it's a kind of empirical thing, inventing a sound or a technique. Some things come out. Well, there are times I wanted to do something, like throat singing I heard, and I just kept doing it until I figured out how to do it, like a child learning to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's all of these things kind of happening at the same time. At the moment of kind of empirical discovery, it's also like a gut feeling, or that feels good. There's a particular kind of energy that or feeling, the sound itself kind of gives me in my gut, that I feel it to be appropriate to some sort of feeling that I might want to express.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a sound,
And you're in that sound.
and that then I store it away. And then there's so that's kind of irrational, right? And then all these techniques I have as a composer, I can do spectral analysis, I can figure out what approximations these microtones can, and then I orchestrate it, and that helps create. So there's a wild utterance, in the forest, and then I can frame it in terms of a rational frame, to give that utterance a syllabaric relevance.
And Kim, do you think of mentors or people who were important to you, people who you learned from? Do you think about sort of aspiring to their level or something like that? Is that important to you?
It's complicated,
Yeah.
and I want to backpedal one step and say the traditions that I grew up in of Western classical music, the Viennese school, the French school, the Russian school. We, as Americans, were lucky enough to have a fantastic influx of immigrants from all of those places, World War II times. So we as Americans had at our fingertips the visceral responses of the musicians who actually grew up in these traditions. And what I learned from people like Felix Gallimere, who was an immigrant from Vienna, and from my teacher, and from people like Walter Trampler, who was the great violist of the previous generation, was that no matter how it got colored, their roots were in folk music. So what I found for myself, having gone through the stage of wanting to be able to do all the things they could do, and both so specifically the artisan type things, like I want to be able to move that reliably and that quickly and that smoothly. I want to be able to do this and that they can do. But it immediately turned a corner and said, okay, once I can do that, what do I want to be doing?
Then what? Yeah.
Then what? And that's where we all, especially those of us who are stuck as interpreters only, we have a score, we have the architecture is there on the and we have to turn it into sonic reality. But the architecture is there for us. So how do we delve in and find what's underneath that, and how do we try to access the composer. What were they thinking? What might they have been feeling? Never mind. You I can ask, it's okay. The guys we can't ask anymore, right? How do you get the power of polarized thinking? What were they thinking? What were they feeling? What comes out of the ground of their folk culture? And how do you integrate that through your own experience and make it move through your own body? Your body is your resonance chamber, no matter whether you play the piano or the violin or sing. The body is still your resonance chamber.
So your act of interpretation is always tied to the composer in some way.
It had better be, but that's a reference point.
Mm-hmm.
It's only a reference point. It's, if you think of a composer or a composition as being an empty building with nothing in it, and our job is to inhabit that building, both with warmth, with love, with material objects of one sort or another. We have the job of inhabiting an empty building, which is a pure structure. So the score that we work with, I see a piece of the music of Bach, and that's architecture of the highest level. There's nothing wrong. There's not one single line out of place.
Mm-hmm.
But it still needs to be inhabited and made visceral. So that's my job, is to be a virtuoso inhabiter of sound.
Right. What you were saying earlier about, once you can connect all the notes, what then? Made me think of Murray Pariah. A friend of mine went to him for advice about this question about virtuosity, and he said, well, in order to be more than a virtuoso, first you have to become a virtuoso. In other words, you got to pass through that one way or the other, and then you do what you want to do pianistically or in any other way.
I understand and agree with that, and yet I'm going to add an experience that I had with Felix Gallimere, the violinist, who is no longer with us, but he started a performance of the Brahms Horn Trio, and he put his bow on the string and he pulled that first open G string, and I was crying. Why? Because there was so much depth and meaning in that note, and it was not easy for him. He struggled to get there. And that is another form of virtuosity, to get past all your weaknesses and still communicate deeply. That for me is also virtuoso. Not everyone can do what Murray Pariah does,
right.
But some people who don't are also incredibly potent communicators. And bottom line, that's how I define what does virtuoso really mean. It means getting into people's hearts. Sometimes it's done by skill level, and sometimes by other magical means. Yeah.
John, percussion, it's very muscle-centered music, It's physical. It depends on physical strength, manual dexterity, sometimes speed, things like that. What's beyond that? And do you think does this question revolve through your mind,
For sure, yeah, because it is very physical. And the stereotypical Afro-Cuban drummer is a man with big upper body strength, big shoulders, and what have you. But that's all changed a lot. It's evolved a lot over the years to the point where, it's refined. The technique of playing has refined a lot, and a lot of drum set rudiments and concepts that are usually applied to playing with sticks are now, for the last several decades, applied to playing hand drums. And that's what gives birth to somebody like Giovanni Hidalgo and other folks who are not built that way. And a lot of women, more and more women are playing now because this new style of playing you don't have to be a big upper body, built like that. And a lot of great drummers are not built like that. And instead they have this technique that they've developed. And it comes to mind also for me, somebody like Zakir Hussain,
Sure.
who I've had the opportunity, I've known him for many years, but I've had the opportunity to play with him quite a few times in the past few years because of our association with SF Jazz. And he's an incredible master in every way, and virtuoso. But the nature of his tradition is deep on a lot of levels, but one of the things that makes the masters there is they have to be able to play also precise and very complex rhythmic figures, very fast, and that whole impressive speed thing is part of that mastery, part of the tradition, as well as beautiful melodic phrasing and things.
Yeah.
But even he, because he's such a world musician, he plays with jazz groups all the time. He plays in the jazz world. He told me a similar story about like Manny with the too many rolls and no butter, because jazz is the same way. Jazz, there's a language, and when you hear somebody take a solo, it can move you in a lot of ways. But most of the time, especially the musicians and the people that know the tradition, are not as impressed with all the speed as they are with how you're telling your story.
Yeah.
So he told a story about playing for the first time as a 20-year-old. He was playing with John McLaughlin and with Miles. It was his first time to play with Miles Davis, and he was so excited, and he said, I wanted to do my best and play. So he played all his stuff, and he just all this incredible speedy stuff. And he said Miles sauntered over to him while he was playing. You know the story?
No,
But you can see it coming,
I know
right?
some like it.
Yeah,
I know
I'm sure,
stories
yeah.
like it. So yeah.
Miles has done this to a lot of folks. And so there's a young Zakir ripping. And while he's playing, he says into his ear, too many freaking notes. So, I mean, Miles was epitome of that. We would certainly consider him a virtuoso, but he wasn't one of those 1,000 notes per measure kind of guys, in stark contrast to a lot of the beboppers, a lot of the other folks that his contemporaries. So, the question about drumming, it's a language, and the sound and the traditional repertoire, and then how you interpret it and how you apply it to a given situation is what would make a master. And so I think in this tradition, the term master goes above a virtuoso, because you might have a virtuoso but in a group or not. It's not necessary to have one. But if you had one, it's really the job of everybody else to do what's necessary to support the soloist and to make things work. So you have to know how to do that. It's a skill. Mm-hmm. Of knowing how to play less and know how to accompany and know how to comp and know when to step in and when to step back, and the use of dynamics and all those other musical aspects. So it's a lot more involved than just strength. In some traditions, the strength is important. Like if you're playing in the street in a carnival music and you're marching, you're carrying a drum off your shoulder, that just carrying the drum is an act of physical strength. And then you're playing the drum with a strap on your shoulder, and every time you hit that drum, it's tugging on your shoulder like that.
Yeah.
Every time you strike it, and you're playing for hours and hours and hours in the street, as hard as you could play to be heard above brass instruments and bells and snare drums and bass drums, and you're playing by hand. Then there's other traditions where it's much more subtle, and you play accompanying vocalists, and you need to play under the vocalist. And traditionally, the vocalists would not have microphones. So you had to be able to play at a whisper, but with all the intensity and all the strength that you need.
Right.
So I don't know if that addresses what your question was.
And playing softly but with intensity is a whole other category.
Precisely. I think of Julio Barreto, a great drummer that played with Gonzalo Urubalcaba for many years, Cuban drummer, who is the first guy that comes to my mind, but that's a mark of a great drummer to me, somebody who could play with all the strength and speed and interpretation, but at a whisper. It's very hard to do with a drum set that can be so loud and with sticks. A lot of drummers can bash it out and play with a lot of strength, but to keep that intensity at a low level is something very difficult to do, and the sign of a real master to me.
Has the it's funny how quickly we just have gotten beyond the idea of virtuosity. Like I feel like it's, you know, we're already ahead of it. But I want to refer back to it anyway. Has the idea of virtuosity seemed oppressive to any of you at any point as musicians?
Only from the perspective of feeling that however much that you practice is not enough. You know, so there's the onus of like, wow, I could be a lot better, a lot faster, a lot cleaner if I only had more and more hours in the day.
Yeah.
But of course, as you know, raising a family, what have you, there are so many things that take you away from your practice time.
Yeah.
But you know, the masters in this tradition are usually people who combine, for example, are able to sing a song that has really beautiful melody and a very unique phrasing while they hold a steady rhythm that also is syncopated, and be able to improvise while holding that steady rhythm. And that's a tradition, for example, in rumba, that the lead singer is playing the claves, playing clave, and then improvising and phrasing very freely on top of that. And that's very virtuosic in a lot of senses, but I think in the traditional classical sense, first impression would be that it's not virtuosic. But as far as the pressure, I think it's something that it's not on the radar. As people are learning, you're trying to learn this canon of music and be good at improvising and be solid with your rhythm. And they're not tripping on being a virtuoso. It's something that's kind of like, that's another world.
Well, I think certainly that for someone whose basic training started and continues in the classical world, getting your skill level where it needs to be is maybe not oppressive, but certainly takes a lot of time and energy and attention. And it's the job of artists and true virtuosos to make sure that young people or people who are growing up in the tradition don't get stuck there. But it is a danger. It's very, very important not to get stuck in what I'll call the craftsmanship, and to make sure that it's serving the purpose of true communication.
When you teach, do you tell your students this notion about music as a house to be lived in, and you know, the house is fine, but you have to live in it and be inside it? And have you imparted that to others?
Well, actually, I said it this way
I'm sorry.
for the first time.
Oh, you
today.
did?
Yeah, this was kind of improvisation on my part.
Really?
That's virtuosic.
I just was trying to explain what I thought. I've never actually said it that way. But I'll tell a little story, with your permission.
Yes.
I took my class. I was doing a summer course, and there were some, not my usual class, but a bunch of Chinese kids who were teenagers. And I usually teach 18 and up, and these kids were like 15 to 18. And they were straight from China. And it happened that in Boston, the Matisse exhibit was in its final week. And it wasn't his paintings that were so wonderful there, but that they were exhibiting the objects from which he painted. So some of the vases and the chairs and these things were on exhibit next to the paintings. So I got to take my class in, and we stood in front of 4 paintings of the vase. One was in purples, one was in greens, one was black and white, the other one was something else. They're looking at it. How come he did that? How come he did green when the actual vase is blue? Why did he do that, Miss Kashkashian? And I said, well, I want you to think of it this way. When you practice the Bach G major suite today, it's got to sound different than it's going to tomorrow, right? If it doesn't, you're not doing a good job. Oh, you mean I get to sound different? So, yeah, it's that. It's that. It's giving permission to yourself and to the audience to have a very different experience given the same architecture.
Right.
Right? Yeah. So yeah, I do try to make that clear. And I also try to make it clear that skill by itself is, what was it? It's rolls without the butter. It's the same. It's the same thing. It's empty words. Yeah. It has to be inhabited by something. And I am convinced, and I remain an optimist on this, that anyone, either trained or not trained in musical traditions, can tell the difference between a true sound and a not true sound. Anyone at all.
True sound and a not true sound.
Yeah.
I guess using other terms that we've been using today, that could also be like an embodied sound
Yes.
and a not embodied sound.
Yes. Yeah.
Anybody can tell the difference between
Anybody
a true
can
sound
tell the difference.
and a not true sound.
Yes.
That's amazing. It's a challenge too.
Yes.
What you're saying sounds right, and it's well, it's fascinating. So Ken,
Yes. Oppressive?
yeah,
Yes. Inasmuch as that the normative means of assessment is often historical and pre-exists us, and sometimes in a different culture. And these are the lenses that we often look at people and judge people, you know. And so I would like to our society to kind of reframe those. Well, first suspend such assessment and be more open, and reframe those mechanisms of assessment so that maybe we can receive more of that true sound, which might be, might be something that confounds our normative expectations. You know, and then, if I may, also my story. The best, I tell this story all the time, but it changed my life. I heard a lecture once by B.B. King.
oh yeah,
And he brought his band to Harvard, and he said, I'm going to show you what I do. And he had his band vamp on a 12-bar blues. It was an A. And he said, now I can play the right notes. You know, and he did. It was like fifth position, A pentatonic, and then he stopped. And he said, now I can play the same notes, but turn it on. Yeah, and it was like, whoa, that's B.B. King. And that little space is so palpable, it's powerful, right? He demonstrated why he's B.B. King, playing the same notes, and everybody else just plays guitar. And it's palpable, right? That's why he was B.B. King. You know, but then I was thought like, wow, this was really problematic as a graduate student composer. Like, well, but the notes, I'm writing down the notes.
sure.
What I knew I can put a little, you know. But then I was like, wow, it's not just about the, you know, there's other things that I haven't actually been trained in, because it's harder to theorize about that little space, that kind of emanation of his aura that we can feel. We're all fans of our favorite artists or everybody, right? We feel that truth in some sort of way. But in my training, we never really talked about it. We were like in the score as material, you know. And then, of course, when we rehearsed and we had concerts, and our teachers tried to coach that and shape it and try to get that energy to speak.
Yeah.
And we kind of pick up on it through like empirical kind of practice.
Yeah.
But it's a slippery thing to theorize about. You know?
You think there's any music that that is so demanding, and so specific and so demanding that just to play all the notes is as much as one can do? In other words, just to hit all the notes is as close as you're going to get to living in that house. Like, I'm thinking of, I mean, Xenakis wrote some crazy pieces for solo violin, maybe viola too, right? You've probably played them. Those look, I mean, what do you do when you're faced with that score?
I actually do want to say something about this.
Please.
Yeah, because you can see a score like that, which is, in theory, if you want to say you're going to actually play all the notes exactly, you will never get to the truth of the music. And so you have to give up the detail sometimes. And this is something Robin taught me, a percussionist that he writes for me and her together. He used to anyway. Really, yeah. She was playing one of those Xenakis pieces. Uh-huh. And I had the privilege of listening to her practice. And I could see that there were a few motions that she was having trouble with. And the thing that worked for her was to let go of it and let it go absolutely through her body. So she would get more of the right notes and more of the right gesture by letting go and letting it go through her body. Mm-hmm. So detail, I mean, a lot of notes is detail, mm-hmm. right? And you have to see then, okay, the edifice is made of tiny little bricks, and the thing that matters is the wall. So you have to give something up, right, in order to get the real thing.
Right.
Or Garth Knox from the Arditi Quartet, he used to say that to me all the time. He said, Kim, notes, don't think about the notes. Pick the ones that matter and make the gesture. Yeah, which is not to say that when I was recording the Ligeti Sonata, I spent an enormous amount of time and tears and blood and all kinds of excessiveness learning the presto movement. Mm. But the only successful performances of it that I gave were ones where I gave it up.
It's a real riddle, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
it is.
Notes
yeah.
are everything, and maybe not nothing, but overrated or something like that. You know,
you have to know which ones to give up.
You have to know which ones
are actually creating the edifice.
Yeah.
I think if you have a lot of notes in complex music, it often has the same effect as traditional virtuosities, like fasts and tactile, and a composition can express that kind of level of sparkliness too.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it might actually be harder to get to the truthful sound. So can that person do it with one note?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kinetic energy.
When you don't have the thing to this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kinetic energy is one aspect, but being able to do that on one pianissimo, full of content, that's virtuoso too. Yeah.
And then in an improvised ensemble context, there's a whole bunch of other considerations. As you said earlier, in Afro-Latin music, it's not quite so much about the soloist. There's something else. I don't know what you would call it, but there's something else. There's some other, higher refinement. I don't know if you would call it grace or. Before this started, we were talking about this record that John and I both love, and John knows much more deeply than me, called Patato Itto Tico, and it's led by two percussionists, Patato Valdez and Tico Arango. Recorded in 1967. 67. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, John called it the Bible or the.
It's a sacred.
Text. It's a sacred text. It's a sacred text. Every rumbero, everyone involved in Afro-Latin percussion, probably in any way, has either heard it and knows it well or knows of it. And so there is some playing on it that I was suggesting to you before. There is some playing on it that most people could point to and say, well, that's virtuosic, especially Arsenio Rodriguez, the tres player, which is sort of like a guitar. But the rest of it, there needs to be another word for it. It's so the time feeling of the record, everything is just sliding around all over the place, and there's lots of there's just lots of spaces for the listener and the musician, I'm sure, to sort of step into it. It's such a non-fixed kind of thing, and it's one of the most graceful records in the world. And yet I can still imagine a lot of people hearing it, and if they had to judge, they might say, well, this isn't exactly virtuosic. It's something else, but it's not exactly virtuosic. So I mean, like, what do you call it?
Well, in Spanish music, they have something called duende. It's the spirit of the music. And you mentioned the word grace, and there's a word that's used a lot in the Yoruba tradition called ache.
Yes.
Ache is grace.
Yes.
It has to do with spiritual groundedness, and there's a lot of possible interpretations of the word, but grace is one that's used a lot. It's also used to say amen. So you say something that is very truthful. Somebody will say ashe after you said it because it means amen. Like
yes.
That's what you just said is the word. And that exists in this music. You know, that Afro-Cuban record you're talking about, all the folks who are associated with that record grew up with these West and Central African traditions, which are very steeped in similar, even though they might be Congo, they might be from Dahomey, they might be from Nigeria, they might be from Benin, but they have this common thread of honoring the ancestors, of musically having the duple and triple meter working together very seamlessly. Mm-hmm. And that's something, of course, that informs most African-based music in the Americas, of being able to, if you're playing in four, like in jazz, if you're playing in four, you have to be able to play every permutation of a triplet against that. And if you're playing in three, you also have to be able to superimpose phrasing in duple meter. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, it becomes mathematical. Mm-hmm. There's that mechanical aspect is part of the tradition. And all of those folks on that record have those traditions since their childhood. So it becomes an understood thing. It's kind of like blues musicians getting together, old timers, and they get together, and it's fairly simple, maybe from a harmonic standpoint or from a technical standpoint, but when they sit down and play and sing, it's deep, and you can feel it immediately. Yeah. And that's what that record has. And it's all about the space. So what, you know, they wouldn't use the word so much virtuosity, but masters they are. And they know tons and tons of songs and cantos, chants and songs. They know a countless number, hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of different chants and songs and how they go with the rhythm. And any one of them would be a challenge for somebody mm-hmm. who's not from in that tradition. It would seem like it's difficult to do, but it's something that they grew up with. Mm-hmm. And they know so many of them that we could look at that and say, wow, that's virtuosic, to be able to just randomly pick, you know, I know what songs to sing and what sequence and how to fit them in the rhythm, which is very important. Once the rhythm is going and you're gonna sing a song, you have to know where on that rhythm to put that song, and you have to be able to adjust to where the rhythm is. Mm-hmm. So it's a canon of knowledge that all of the folks on that record were very steeped in, and which is why there's magic on that record. And you know, it's funny though, when I hear you say anybody who's involved in the music would know that record, and it's not true. The people who would know that record are the people in this country, because in Cuba, mm-hmm. after the revolution, those are all folks who were in Cuba and left Cuba after the revolution. Right. So for all the post-revolutionary Cubans who stayed in there, most of them don't know anything about that record. Right. So, but they would hear that record, and for the most part, they would recognize everything that's going on there, the songs and the rhythms, be able to play them. They might even find they might be critical, which brings up something that occurred to me while we were talking, is that, you know, when you first come to these traditions, sometimes when it calls you, just the sound of an instrument will move you. Like when you say one note, same with even a conga drum, you hear mm-hmm. a note, bing, mm-hmm. and you hear that tone, and it just touches you, mm-hmm. and it moves you. And every time you hear that sound, it brings you joy. But then you start learning a few things, and you start becoming a critic. You start thinking, wow, actually that person is not getting that good of a sound out of that drum. That person's rhythm is not that good. And you start, you know, not having as much joy around it as you had before, when anybody who hit the drum gave you joy. And it's something that you have to learn how to get back to, the kind of a childlike aspect where just the sound of the drum and what that person is expressing from their heart. But then as you get more experience and you start really recognizing the virtuosity in the sound to the point where you hear a note, a couple notes, and you realize that's Peraza, that's Aguabella, that's Mongo, and you know from their sound. And it's a beautiful and distinct sound on the same drum. And one hand hitting a drum, you think it would sound the same, and the drum sounds and feels very different depending on who's hitting it and who's playing it.
What's our timetable? Should we have some questions, maybe, or?
I was going to jump in. I was going to say, be quiet, please, but it's so interesting. I don't have the nerve to do it. Do we want to open the conversation to some questions?
I'd like to. Oh,
I
Ken.
just want to make a comment. I thought there was an interesting point of contact between what you said, Kim, about filling this house with the spirit of the composer or in your tradition, and then what you were saying about the spirits and that there's this kind of in your diverse ways a kind of invocation, incantation that it's like an element of your practice. And calling forth of a spirit that's outside of you, or somehow being able to connect it to it, right? And
Or what Rudolf Serkin
whatever.
used to call it. He said, I pray before I walk on stage that I will be an empty, open channel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A musician I know described virtuosity as the condition of when you feel that the instrument is playing you. But I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
I would say that's when the instrument doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. There is no instrument.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So let's have some questions from anyone.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
So the discourse here seems to be all about the kind of mastery of the. That's John's word, mastery. Oh my God. A kind of mastery of the instrument. Is there not an element of kind of struggle against the instrument? I mean, several of you mentioned Jimi Hendrix, who was kind of at war with his guitar. And one had the impression that there was a certain amount of violence being carried out on the instrument. And I'm wondering if there isn't a kind of tension between the attempt to communicate and the kind of materiality of the instrument that's at work here as well. I mean,
Ken,
that somehow being able to play too well.
Why don't you take that on? What's the significance of Jimi Hendrix breaking his guitar?
in the 1967 performance of Wild Thing at Monterey Pop, he set it on fire. He had a strategic thing where he didn't want to do an encore, and also wanted to be flashier than the Who were known for destroying their instruments, but he's going to set it on fire, right? But then at the introduction of it, he says, don't think it's strange, I'm going to do something here. And he says, I'm going to sacrifice something I love.
Yeah.
That was really beautiful, And then he was still performing these frequencies that are real kind of powerful, right? And he's not playing the guitar anymore, but he's moving it and getting different kinds of feedback, setting it on fire, but it's a different kind of performance practice. And I think Jimi Hendrix invented a new kind of electric guitarism in which the main discourse of sound is not the fretted fundamental anymore, but it's this frequency space and feedback that he's unleashing, and maybe part of the new physical actions, the histrionics are part of the performance practice to communicate that, to get that out of the instrument.
I always felt that that Jimi, and not being a guitar player, but being a real fan of rock and electric guitar, like I used to know all of Jimmy's solos playing air guitar. I knew I could imitate them. But Jimi, I felt, was in total mastery of his instrument. It seemed like he was one with the instrument. He could do anything he wanted with that instrument. Yeah. And then there's the aspect of performance. Performance brings a whole nother level where virtuosity is important. And then once you've done all that, you're looking for something more to impress, and in the performance, it goes into other directions. But with certain styles of music that are not necessarily geared toward performance, in traditional contexts and in communities that have been around for a long time, where it's not about performance, And then it's about knowing the code, and the virtuosos are the ones who know the rhythmic code, how to bring what they're bringing, whether it's whatever they're bringing, melodic, harmonic, or rhythmic, that it's always rhythmic. There's a rhythmic code that you have to know, and you have to understand that as a vocalist or as a arranger or composer, you have to understand that rhythmic code. And even at a certain point as a soloist, you soloist within this rhythmic code. And those are the folks that are really the people inside the tradition I think respect the most and say, and will just nod their head to, because that person can just freely improvise and or come up with traditional things, and it's always on the money in terms of where it fits in the rhythmic matrix of things. That's kind of the bottom line, I think, with a lot of Afro-Caribbean tradition, at least Afro-Latin.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jimi Hendrix's histrionics were also trapped him too, and then he started realizing people expected him to play with his guitar and behind his back and all that. And then so he disbanded his group and created a band called Band of Gypsies, and he wanted to just focus on the music.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
To speak to that question of the urgency and the difficulty of doing music, I think if we all think about it as more a process of sculpting the sound out of whatever our medium is, instead of painting it, that 3 and even maybe 4-dimensional aspect of getting something out of yourself and through your instrument and out to the last person who's out there listening. That's not easy. It takes great concentrated effort. And whether that looks like resistance or whether it looks like virtuosity, I think they're both basically different aspects of these dimensions that have to come through to people. So I would like to just, for myself, think of virtuoso as someone who can communicate, who knows how to get across what they want to get across, whether it's with great resistance or whether it looks like easy kinetic energy or anything. And they're talking, like the Budapest Quartet, the Sándor Végh String Quartet, the Amadeus Quartet. They're all older groups, and they were all post-World War II groups. And I think that had something to do with why these 3 groups in particular are still icons for us of, wow, nobody ever did the Mozart quartets as the Amadeus did. Nobody has ever done the Bartók quartets the way the Végh Quartet has done them. This is something that we look at and say, and what makes it so great? They weren't the greatest players. Any conservatory graduate is going to play the instrument better than those guys do. But they had something. And they had something that I'm going to call the ability to carve in 3 dimensions and talk.
Just give me the image, just so I really understand it. Okay. You're talking about carving. Are they carving something out of themselves, or are they carving something from the pre-existing music?
Out of themselves,
yes.
And out of the material of the instrument into the sonic realm. Yeah, so not the empty edifice,
right.
But what does it take to turn that edifice into something alive?
Right.
Yeah.
It's amazing how the conversation keeps coming back to the basic or the simple, or not the simple, the opposite of lots and lots and lots of notes. The opposite of that. I have a friend who was a journalist in London when Jimi Hendrix first arrived there, and he was like 20 years old and writing about music, and his editor said, "There's a guy named Jimi Hendrix who's in town. Why don't you check him out? And he told me that what he remembers from that first encounter with him at this club in London was the first note. You know, like the rest of Jimi Hendrix, yeah, sure, he's fine, he's really good. But encountering him for the first time, the first note, hearing the sound, one note, is the thing that he remembers most. And now that I'm thinking of it, the Jimi Hendrix solo that runs through my head most often is the one note of Machine Gun that lasts for 15 seconds. It's such a note. There's so much in it.
Yeah.
Do you see a relationship between virtuosity and one's knowledge, understanding, or love of the tradition that they're coming out of? How much of a student do you need? How important is it to be a student of your culture and your tradition as opposed to being purely an excellent technician?
Yeah, well, in my experience, it's everything. In Afro-Cuban tradition, Afro-Puerto Rican tradition, it's all about that. It's all about learning from the elders and learning that language, and then being able to distill it and being able to speak and improvise and express and interpret also in your own way. Although it traditionally comes from a repertoire that's not written. It's a canon of thousands and thousands and thousands of melodies and songs, and combined with rhythms from different traditions and drumming. So it's a huge unwritten canon. So people who carry that tradition in their minds are the ones who are, you bow your heads to, and they know. For example, I'd like to give you a sample just of what I'm talking about. Like if you take a song, a melody, and how you fit it with a rhythm. For example, something like this. This is a song that comes traditionally from the area of Benin. It's called the Ancient Kingdom of Dahomey. And in Cuba, there's this tradition has held through the colonial period, and to this day, it's a small, relatively small tradition of folks who have carried it on, and it's been passed down in an oral tradition. But it's part of this canon that informs popular music as well. And the concept is what's important. When you have a melody, you can't just sing the melody anywhere with the rhythm. So if you have a rhythm that goes like this, where are you going to sing the melody on this? It has everything to do with doing it correct or not. So, for example, Sara wo demo, Sara wo de, Sara ti dinamo, Sara wo de. Sara wo demo, Sara wo de, Sara ti dinamo, Sara wo de. Agromito na wado. Sara wo demo, Sara wo de, Sara ti dinamo, Sara wo de. Agromidona wado, sori moloya, aceto maya we bongoni parani fanfa, ye maya lode, aceto maya we ala ufanfa. It's complex, but the masters of this tradition know thousands and thousands of those. I mean, it sounds like an exaggeration, and it's not. There's so many that come from Benin, that come from Ijesa land, that come from Yoruba land, that come from the Abakwa tradition, that come from the different Congo and Kikongo traditions that have mixed in different ways in Cuba, in Haiti, in Puerto Rico, in Brazil, in Venezuela. And so the whole Afro-Latin popular tradition in Latin jazz and salsa and dance music is informed by that. And we have those same rules. If you're a composer or a arranger, you have to keep that in mind when you have melodies, how they fit with the rhythm, how they fit with the clave. And it's a canon, but it's unwritten. So that's the mastery. And we don't usually refer to them as virtuosos, but that they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It seems like there's a difference between possessing or exhibiting or inhabiting virtuosity. and recognizing it and observing it. And I'm wondering if you see that difference, like performing virtuosity versus observing virtuosity. And it seems like in the former, where you perform virtuosity, that there's a lot of interpretation involved, like you talked about inhabiting the house, and while at the same time maybe masking that the work or the skill or making it seem like the instrument's not there. So there's a paradox there where you're like, you know.
That's a good question.
But my question is, to what extent is observing virtuosity pre-interpretive, right? Because you spoke about the one note, or a lot of you invoked being a child or the child as an image of kind of just knowing it since childhood, what virtuosity is, or recognizing it. So I guess my question is, to what extent is recognizing what virtuosity is like a pre-interpretive act, something we do before we think about it? Or is that itself just are we just pretending like we don't know? Do we actually have more knowledge than we think we do? Does that make sense?
You're asking, how does the listener how does the listener react to? Is that?
Yeah. Is it something that requires musical knowledge to know
No.
what it is? Or
Absolutely doesn't require any musical knowledge whatsoever. Because you're reacting viscerally, either to the kinetic energy piece of the puzzle that we've been talking about, or to the pure communication piece of the puzzle, which is what we're mainly calling the sonic experience, right? True sound. And everybody feels that. It goes to your heart. So you're going to respond to it either by your heart going, or you're going to want to get up and dance. And those are both great responses and responsibilities, I would care to say, of the audience, to actually be in a dialogue with what you're hearing. Yeah.
I think a lot of what we talked around, and maybe some of us might try to reframe virtuosity as a state of being. In that moment, just being. And I think children are really good at that. And right, we often accumulate these like barriers and kind of self-prohibitions and restrictions. And at that moment of just essentially being freer, there's a possibility, hopefully, of this kind of emanation of a particular kind of spirit that's palpable, hopefully. Yeah, it starts sounding like someone from Berkeley, right? Dude, yeah. No, but I like the language because, in my training, we never talked about this,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to add also that virtuosity also overlaps a great deal, I think, with showmanship, and maybe even to take it a step further, showboating, where it's a performance thing, and you're going to get a rise out of the audience when you play a fast role. Whereas for the musicians in the audience, they're not going to be as impressed with that. They're going to, if you see somebody in the audience who you respect, or a teacher, or somebody who understands, you're going to be a little more responsible, maybe about trying to play something that they're going to appreciate, that your peer will appreciate the musicality and the depth of it. And just sitting there and playing a roll, and guarantee the audience is going to, the audience always reacts to the speed, and it becomes a tool, a device, and it's not part of our tradition, but it's something that we do, and especially if we make a living at being a musician, where in a society like ours, where it's really about entertainment, and the music is, the importance of music is its value as entertainment, and how many units are sold, and precisely how big of a rise you get out of that audience is going to decide how much you ask for next time, and if you get the call back, and all those aspects. And it's akin to minstrelsy, where the musicians are just expected to come and entertain us and make us laugh, make us cry, make us clap, and then get out of here. We're not that interested in what you consider the depth of your tradition, or the fact that you're not making any money, you're not getting paid very well. It doesn't matter. what's important is that you're entertaining us, and then, off the stage. So, I think for those of us who come from traditional styles of music, it's a dilemma, because we have to play that game. We are on stage, quote unquote, entertaining folks. Often have to be aware of that. But I think for a lot of jazz musicians and a lot of folkloric type musicians, they couldn't give a flying bean whether you want me to play a role or you're going to be impressed with how fast I play. It doesn't matter to me.
Right? Yeah, that's right.
If an aspect of virtuosity is channeling and inhabiting what a composer might have been trying to express, if you were working with a live composer who is perhaps writing for you, and this is for any of you, or was workshopping a piece to see what worked and what didn't, what would you feel comfortable saying to the composer as the musician, as the, thank you.
Should I take that one? Sure. Well, it depends on the composer. If it's Ken Ueno, I would say anything I wanted and I wouldn't have to be careful. I could say, exactly what you want this to sound like? And then I'd say, well, but that's not the best way to get it. How about this? Oh. And there are other composers that I would also be able to treat that way, like Peter Etvish. In fact, he would ask me. He'd say, how do I get this? He'd play it at the piano. How do you want me to write so that it sounds like this on the viola? Now, if it were Kortag, you wouldn't say a damn word. You wouldn't dare. You'd just say, okay, I'm gonna try, I'm gonna try, I'm gonna try. And you try for 5 hours until everybody's in tears, and maybe the next day you get it. So but it's a privilege, a real privilege, to be able to get that kind of feedback and work together with a composer. It's a fantastic part of what we do. Yeah. I don't know if that helped.
Alan, last question. Oh, sorry. This is an amateurish question from a listener who listens to a lot of music and knows nothing about music. I was thinking of two singers. One is Towns Van Zandt, if anyone knows him, and Chabela Vargas. I just saw a documentary about her. So these are singers who were ravaged by alcoholism, and later in their lives, their voices sounded very, very broken down. So some of my most intense listening experiences are of singers who are very far from perfection, that are really broken down, and they describe the experience that you were describing when you were describing about communicating your being. But they are not, they're very far away from anything like perfection. So can you address this? That is, they're the opposite of virtuosos, and they seem incredibly human, they're barely getting along, and the musical experience is very, very powerful.
I guess we're redefining virtuoso, aren't we? Because we're saying that if it's a powerful musical experience, that's how I would like to define virtuosity. The ability to give a powerful musical experience. It's not just about whether it's perfect or fast. Yeah.
I think about that when I listen to Bob Dylan and his music performed by other people, and then people like Adele, who's covered his music much more normatively virtuosic, as compared to Bob Dylan himself, right, who's famously mocked for his lack of instrumental, But as a fan of Bob Dylan, there's an authority to his voice delivering his own songs that are inextricably kind of linked spectrally. And the way I might try to translate that sense of like fandom and association with that particular voice, as even though it's someone I've never met, is someone that I admire and as kind of feel like I have a relationship with as a fan, is like when I pick up the phone and someone says my name and I immediately recognize it's my mom. But there's something really complex too, because often I know what mood she's in. And the music of her sound, not just, being able to recognize her, but that complex thing, I know that I'm in trouble, or like, I gotta fly down to LA because something happened. Something, it's just from that, just from being, that kind of fan association, all the spectral thing. But there's and mapping that feeling onto that voice is very special, right? I mean, people have talked about that it can't be transposed to other voices, and then I think that's an essential quality of community,
For me, what you described as the voice breaking down, that's a big part of our tradition, because the singers are not trained, and they sing. Some of the greatest singers and the ones who touch people the most have gravelly voices, and sometimes might even have a problem with the intonation once in a while, but the message and the feeling is totally there, and what they bring, again, rhythmically. The rhythmic aspect gets overlooked, like with a melodic instrument or when you're singing, but how you sing a melody has everything to do with also how it gets perceived. Billie Holiday was a good example of that, the way she would sing, and a lot of blues players, a lot of jazz players, a lot of Cuban and Puerto Rican players also come from these marginal upbringings where there's a lot of alcoholism and drug abuse, and these artists come out of that tradition. So a lot of times their voices reflect that, yet and still they totally move people when they would interpret what they're doing. Billie was famous for singing way behind the beat, almost to the point that to the non-listener you'd think that she was lost, but she was not lost. There's great footage of her where she's playing with Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, and she's nodding, and she sings her line, and way behind, which tune they're singing, it might be Strange Fruit, and she sings her line way behind the beat, and then she kind of nods off, and Lester takes a chorus, and you think she's done. She looks like she's asleep and gone, and she comes right in where she's supposed to come in and sings behind the beat, and it's a style, and it's absolutely stunning. When you hear it, you feel that. So it's something we deal with a lot, and overlook the fact that they don't have an operatic voice or a trained voice.
Well, the standards are also cultural again, right? Because from what I understand of like pansori, traditional singing in Korea, the singers like scream at a waterfall for years to like gravel up their throats, which like opera singers would be afraid, that's the worst thing you can do,
Arsenio, who we were talking about too, this great tres player, he did something very fascinating in '63. He had come to New York in 1953 because the mambo was all the rage in New York, and people were making money, and it was very popular. Everybody was playing it and dancing it. People were making money off it, and he knew damn well that he was one of the creators, if not the creator, of what they're now calling mambo. And he came to New York and was doing interviews, and he was pissed off. He was this guy, he was blind black big man who was known for being very ornery, very, in a bad mood all the time. And he had a very gravelly voice. And he would do these interviews where he would say, he'd be complaining and growling, and say, ask the people who are getting credit for the mambo, ask Bebo, ask Pere Prado, ask Cachao, ask them if they didn't come to see my band play in 1940 at such and such a radio station. And he was talking the truth, of course. He knew he was blind, but he knew who was in the audience, what musicians were in the audience, who later got credit for this mambo that he had a lot to do with. So, but he didn't ingratiate himself to anybody. So he couldn't get a decent record contract. He was playing in the street, playing in bars. This was a major force in Cuban music. Finally, he got a record contract in '63 with Columbia Records. Somebody must have convinced Columbia that this guy is really the real thing. But what he was known for was this style from the 40s, where they always had these great singers, some of the greatest singers of the era. Miguelito Cuní, René Alvarez, wonderful vocalists. And what he did, he didn't do anything close to that. He came out with this super African record that was, and he didn't hire a singer, he sang. And his voice was like, hey, his voice sounded like that on the vocals. And he had two saxophones because he said it sounded like the bullhorns that are used in the Congo. And he used it to make a statement that I'm the only one who knows the Congo roots of the mambo. And he was the only one who could do a record like that. It was a very unique, way ahead of its time record. And of course, the record company just panicked. They took it off the shelves. It became a collector's item immediately. They couldn't sell it. They didn't know what to do with it. It's an absolutely gorgeous record with Congolese drums. And he sang, they did Abakwa, Congo music, Yoruba music, absolute masterpiece. And he did it like as a statement, kind of an Italian salute to the powers that be. And you know, he never did make any money. And a few years later, he did his last record, the one that Ben was referring to, in '67. He died a few years later. But he was a true virtuoso on the instrument, on the tres, and for what he knew about the traditions that inform. He's one of the founding fathers of everything we do today in Afro-Cuban based music.
I think, just in response to that question about voices, older voices, I think about, I realize I'm thinking entirely about singers who kind of sounded old when they were young. And then when they get older, they're greater than ever, you know? I mean, I'm thinking of Jimmy Scott and a flamenco singer named Manuel Agujetas. And yeah, I mean, and then when they're older and they're less physically able, there's just more gravity. There's more of what was already there. More gravity, more life force.
There's a particular moment in on Judy Garland's Carnegie Hall concert album where she's singing "Come Rain or Shine." At the end of it, she goes like, "Come rain or," you know, and she's flat.
Yeah.
But at that moment, the audience goes nuts. You know, so there is material failure.
Yeah.
And then communicative success.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And then, what communicated was that she was giving, and her fans received that gesture of giving, and that communicated whether or not she was, you know, in tune or not.
They see the life force.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Life force.
I want to thank Kim and Ken and John.
Thank you.
This was great. And thank you very much. Thank you for